There are peoples whose identity has been so thoroughly constructed by the imagination of those who conquered them, documented them, feared them, romanticized them, and ultimately attempted to destroy them that recovering any accurate understanding of who they actually were, where they came from, how they understood themselves, what the full arc of their history looked like before the catastrophic interruption of European colonization, requires dismantling an extraordinarily dense and durable layer of myth before any genuine historical or scientific investigation can begin. The Apache occupy this position in the American historical imagination with a completeness that is matched by very few other indigenous peoples anywhere in the world. They have been the antagonists of 1,000 Western films, the symbol of savage resistance in the literature of frontier conquest, the subject of military campaigns that the United States Army described in the language of civilization, versus barbarism, and the namesake of attack helicopters, sports teams, and software frameworks, a cultural omnipresence that has paradoxically made them less visible rather than more, because the image has so thoroughly displaced the reality that most people who encounter the word Apache believe they already know what it means. What modern genetic research has now begun to reveal about the Apache, their actual biological origins, the true trajectory of their journey to the American Southwest, the deep ancestry that connects them to populations on the other side of the world, and the specific demographic history that shaped the people the Spanish encountered in the 16th century and that American military forces were still fighting in the 19th, is a story of continental-scale migration, genetic divergence, cultural adaptation, and biological resilience that is simultaneously more ancient, more geographically expansive, and more scientifically surprising than the simplified narrative of southwestern desert warriors that has dominated both popular and scholarly understanding for generations. The DNA does not merely add detail to the existing story. In several crucial respects, it rewrites it entirely, and the rewriting has implications that extend far beyond questions of Apache identity into fundamental issues of how and when the Americas were peopled, what routes the ancestral populations of indigenous Americans followed, and what the relationship is between the genetic record and the extraordinary diversity of cultures, languages, and ways of life that developed across 2 continents over more than 15,000 years of human habitation. To understand what the genetic evidence is revealing, you need to begin not in the American Southwest, but in Siberia, and not in the period of Spanish contact, but at a point somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 years ago, when the population that would eventually give rise to all indigenous Americans was taking shape in the region of northeastern Asia, that population geneticists have identified as the proximate source of the Americas' original human colonization. The story of how humans first entered the Americas is one of the most actively contested questions in all of human prehistory, and the broad outlines of the answer, that the founding population crossed from northeastern Asia into northwestern North America at some point during the late Pleistocene, using the land bridge of Beringia that connected the 2 continents during periods of glacially lowered sea levels, have been known in their general form for decades. What has changed dramatically with the advent of ancient DNA research and large-scale genomic analysis of both contemporary indigenous populations and ancient skeletal remains is the resolution of that picture, the number of founding, migration events, the genetic composition of the founding populations, the routes by which different groups spread across the continents after entry, and the relationships between contemporary indigenous populations and the ancient individuals whose genomes have been recovered from archaeological sites across both North and South America. The Apache belong to the Athabaskan linguistic family, one of the most geographically remarkable language families in the entire world, distributed across a range that stretches from the subarctic forests of Alaska and northwestern Canada all the way to the desert southwest of the United States, with a disjunct southern extension that includes not only the various Apache groups, but also the Navajo, their linguistic and genetic relatives who share the Athabaskan heritage and whose own history of migration from the north to the southwest follows a parallel trajectory. The existence of this vast geographic distribution of related languages, a distribution that puzzled and fascinated linguists from the moment it was first systematically documented in the 19th century, is itself one of the most important clues to Apache origins, because it implies a relatively recent migration from the north rather than the kind of deep, in-place development that would produce a tightly clustered geographic distribution of related languages in a small region. The linguistic evidence for an Athabaskan migration from the subarctic to the southwest has been understood in general terms for well over a century. What has been contested is the timing, the route, the speed, and the precise relationship between the southern Athabaskans, the Apache and Navajo, and the northern Athabaskan populations of Canada and Alaska from whom they descend. Archaeological evidence has placed the arrival of ancestral Apache populations in the American Southwest at somewhere between 1200 and 1500 CE, a relatively recent arrival in a region that had been inhabited by other indigenous peoples, including the ancestors of the Pueblo communities, for thousands of years before the Athabaskan newcomers appeared. But the archaeological record is fragmentary, the identification of Athabaskan material culture in the archaeological record is contested, and the specific route by which ancestral Apache populations moved from the subarctic to the southwest, whether through the Great Plains corridor, along the Rocky Mountain front ranges, or through some combination of routes, has been a matter of genuine scholarly disagreement. The genetic evidence that has accumulated from studies of both contemporary Apache populations and the broader Athabaskan family has now provided a level of resolution to these questions that the archaeological and linguistic records alone could not achieve. And some of what it has revealed has been genuinely unexpected. The first and most fundamental finding of the genomic research is that the Apache carry a genetic signature that connects them with remarkable clarity, not to the populations of the American Southwest, where they have lived for the past several centuries, but to the indigenous populations of interior Alaska and northwestern Canada, the northern Athabaskans, whose languages, as the linguists established long ago, are the closest relatives of the Apache and Navajo tongues. This connection is visible in the patterns of shared genetic variants in the identity by descent segments that Apache individuals share with northern Athabaskan populations across thousands of miles of geographic separation, and in the admixture analyses that consistently place Apache ancestry within the cluster of populations associated with the relatively recent Beringian and post-Beringian population movements that brought Athabaskan ancestors into North America. But the genetic story of Apache origins does not begin with the Athabaskan migration into the Southwest. It begins much earlier in the population history of northeastern Asia, and the picture that ancient DNA research has assembled of that deep ancestry is where the most striking and most consequential surprises have emerged. The founding population of the Americas, the group that crossed Beringia and gave rise to the extraordinarily diverse indigenous peoples of both continents, was not genetically homogeneous, and the different indigenous populations of the Americas carry different proportions of the genetic components that were present in the founding population or that arrived in subsequent migration events. The Apaches and other Athabaskan populations carry a genetic profile that differs in specific and measurable ways from the profiles of other indigenous North American populations, differences that reflect both the Athabaskan population's distinct history within North America and the specific genetic composition of the Beringian population from which they ultimately descend. Ancient DNA recovered from archaeological sites in Alaska, the Yukon, and British Columbia, sites associated with ancestral Athabaskan populations going back several thousand years, has allowed researchers to trace the genetic continuity between the ancient subarctic populations and the contemporary Apache with a directness that no amount of linguistic or archaeological comparison could provide. The ancient individuals from these subarctic sites carry genetic profiles that are recognizably ancestral to contemporary Apache populations, confirming the linguistic evidence for a northern origin and providing a temporal depth to the migration story that helps constrain the timing and the route of the southward movement that eventually brought Athabaskan populations to the southwest. The genetic data is consistent, with a relatively rapid southward movement, rapid in archaeological terms, meaning perhaps over the course of a few centuries rather than millennia, which aligns with the archaeological evidence for a late arrival of Athabaskan-associated material culture in the southwest, and with the oral traditions of some Apache groups that preserve memory of a journey from the north. The relationship between the Apache and the Navajo that the genetic data reveals is one of the most instructive findings for understanding the dynamics of the Athabaskan migration and the subsequent divergence of the two groups after their arrival in the southwest. The Apache and Navajo share a substantial core of common ancestry that reflects their common Athabaskan origin and their common migration history. But they also show measurable genetic differences from each other that reflect the different demographic trajectories the two groups followed after their separation and the different degrees to which they interacted and intermarried with the pre-existing populations of the regions they settled. The Navajo show higher levels of genetic admixture with Pueblo populations than the Apache do, a finding consistent with the well-documented historical record of close interaction between the Navajo and the Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley, including the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and its aftermath, during which significant numbers of Pueblo people took refuge among the Navajo and intermarried into Navajo communities in ways that left a permanent genetic trace. The Apache groups that settled in the more peripheral regions of the Southwest, the Chiricahua in what is now southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, the Mescalero in the Sacramento Mountains of New Mexico, the Jicarilla in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, and the Various other Apache bands whose territories, spread across an enormous geographic range, show lower levels of admixture with neighboring Pueblo populations and maintain a genetic profile somewhat closer to the northern Athabaskan baseline, a finding that is consistent with their more mobile, more pastorally oriented way of life and their historically more limited engagement with the sedentary agricultural communities of the region. The genetic variation among Apache groups is itself a significant finding, because it demonstrates that the Apache were never a single undifferentiated population, but a collection of related but genetically distinct communities whose shared Athabaskan heritage was overlaid by centuries of separate demographic history, differential interaction with neighboring peoples, and the random genetic drift that affects any collection of small, semi-isolated communities living across a vast geographic range. One of the most scientifically significant and least widely publicized findings of Apache genetic research concerns the evidence for gene flow between Athabaskan populations and populations of Asian origin that postdates the original Beringian founding event, evidence that the ancestors of the Apache were not simply passengers on a one-way journey from Asia to the Americas, but participants in a more complex and more sustained pattern of population movement and genetic exchange across the North Pacific region that continued long after the initial peopling of the Americas. The specific genetic signal that researchers have identified is consistent with a secondary pulse of Asian-derived ancestry entering the Athabaskan genetic pool through contact with populations in the subarctic and coastal regions of northwestern North America, populations who themselves show evidence of more recent connections to northeastern Asian populations than the general Indigenous American founding population does. This secondary Asian ancestry signal is present in northern Athabaskan populations at detectable levels, and appears, at lower but still measurable levels, in the Apache, a faint echo of a second chapter of trans-Pacific genetic history that was written in the subarctic before the Athabaskan migration southward carried it to the desert southwest. The demographic history of the Apache after European contact is written in the genetic record with a clarity and a brutality that the historical documents, however comprehensive, can only partially convey. The Apache population experienced catastrophic decline following Spanish colonization, though decline driven by epidemic disease, by the violence of colonial warfare, by the enslavement that Spanish colonial authorities practiced against Apache captives, and by the disruption of the subsistence systems on which Apache communities depended. Population genetic analysis of contemporary Apache communities reveals the genetic signatures of these demographic catastrophes in the patterns of reduced genetic diversity, elevated rates of identity by descent sharing, and the specific patterns of linkage disequilibrium that result when a population is drastically reduced and then recovers from a small surviving remnant. The genetic record does not merely confirm the historical record of population decline, it quantifies it, providing estimates of the severity of the bottlenecks that the Apache population passed through during the colonial and early American periods that help researchers understand the demographic scale of what those communities survived. The 19th century American military campaigns against the Apache, campaigns that culminated in the final surrender of Geronimo's band in 1886 and the subsequent imprisonment of the entire Chiricahua Apache community, including those individuals and families who had served as scouts for the American military in detention camps in Florida and Alabama far from their homeland, represented the most concentrated and most deliberately destructive phase of the assault on Apache demographic survival. The Chiricahua Apache, who were imprisoned in 1886, numbered approximately 500 individuals. They were held in conditions that produced devastating mortality from tuberculosis and other diseases over the 2 decades of their imprisonment. By the time the surviving Chiricahua were finally permitted to return to the Southwest in 1913, their numbers had been reduced to a fraction of what they had been at the time of surrender. And the genetic consequences of this extreme bottleneck are visible in the distinctively reduced genetic diversity of contemporary Chiricahua descendants, compared to Apache groups that did not experience equivalent demographic compression. What the genetic research reveals when these colonial and post-colonial demographic catastrophes are placed in the broader context of Apache population history is a story of a people who survived not one but multiple devastating population reductions that would have destroyed the demographic coherence and genetic continuity of most human communities, and who maintained sufficient biological and cultural integrity across those reductions to sustain recognizable communities into the present day. The contemporary Apache nations, the White Mountain Apache, the San Carlos Apache, the Mescalero Apache, the Jicarilla Apache, the Fort Sill Apache, and the Tonto Apache are not the remnants of a broken people. They are the survivors of a gauntlet that lasted 4 centuries and that was specifically designed, in its final American phase, to eliminate them entirely as distinct communities, and their survival is a demographic fact that the genetic record documents with the same precision and the same emotional weight that it brings to documenting everything else about their history. The picture of Apache identity and Apache origins that emerges from the totality of the modern genetic research is one that neither the romanticized popular image nor the reductive historical narrative of frontier conflict has room for. The Apache are the descendants of subarctic hunters who made one of the most dramatic voluntary migrations in the entire history of North American indigenous peoples, traveling thousands of miles from the boreal forests of the Northwest to the desert ranges of the Southwest over the course of centuries, adapting with extraordinary flexibility to environments radically different from those their ancestors had occupied, and arriving in the Southwest carrying a genetic heritage shaped by the deepest movements of human prehistory across the vast Beringian world that connected Asia and the Americas across the roof of the planet. They carry in their genomes the evidence of that ancient journey, the signature of the demographic catastrophes that colonialism inflicted upon them, the genetic traces of their interactions with the many other peoples they encountered across centuries of life in the Southwest, and the biological record of a survival that was never guaranteed, and that the forces arrayed against them at multiple points in their history made very nearly impossible. The DNA does not reveal that the Apache were never what we thought in the sense of exposing a deception or correcting a simple factual error. It reveals something at once more subtle and more profound, that the people who were reduced by the imagination of conquest to a symbol of savage resistance were carrying, in their biology and in their history, a story of human movement, adaptation, survival, and endurance across 15,000 years of American time that is among the most extraordinary stories that the genetic record of any human population anywhere in the world has yet been opened to reveal. What the science is returning to the Apache is not something new. It is something very old. The full depth and complexity of a history that was always there, always written in the genome, and always waiting for the tools that could finally read it.